When we think of Hitler's allies in World War II, a few names come easily to mind. Mussolini's Italy, Japan's empire in the Pacific, Finland on the northern flank, maybe Hungary, or the Waffen-SS legions made up of volunteers. But one country, one blood-soaked partner, is almost always left out of the story. And yet, this nation gave more to the German war machine than any other ally. More men, more oil, more ground forces on the Eastern Front. It led the charge into Soviet territory in 1941. It conquered Odessa after a brutal siege. It bled in the frozen ravines of Crimea. It stood guard on the endless steppes of the Don, holding Germany's flanks at Stalingrad, before being annihilated by a Soviet hammer blow so severe that its armies ceased to exist. That nation was Romania. From the moment Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, Romanian troops marched beside the Wehrmacht across Ukraine and into the heart of Russia. Over 25 divisions, nearly 500,000 men, were committed to the Eastern Front. The Romanian Mountain Corps fought in the cliffs and gorges of Sevastopol. Its cavalry divisions roamed the frozen steppe, engaging partisans and chasing down Soviet scouts. Its infantry died in the tens of thousands, in trenches carved from Ukrainian mud. But it wasn't just soldiers. Romania became one of the Reich's most vital logistical arteries, supplying the German war machine with fuel from the oil fields of Ploiești, food for its armies, and security forces for its occupation zones. While other Axis nations faltered or hesitated, Romania stayed loyal, deeper and longer than almost any other. Until it couldn't. Because at Stalingrad, in the winter of 1942, the very army that had once been Germany's pride on the southern front was utterly destroyed. Crushed by a Soviet onslaught it had no weapons to stop. Outgunned, outnumbered and abandoned, tens of thousands of Romanian soldiers were left to die in the snow. And with them died the dream of Axis victory. This is the story of Romania's war, of the battles it fought, the men it lost, the cities it conquered and the bitter fate it met. Forgotten by most history books, but remembered by those who lived it. This was Hitler's most faithful ally, and this is how it was broken. To understand why Romania became one of Germany's most committed allies in the Second World War, one must look not to Berlin, but to Bucharest. Romania's alignment with the Axis was not the result of coercion or blind loyalty, but a complex outcome of domestic politics, territorial loss, strategic necessity, and deeply rooted ideological fears. In the wake of the First World War, Romania emerged as one of the major territorial winners in Europe. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires allowed Romanian nationalists to unite long-claimed lands under a single crown. Transylvania, Bukovina and Bessarabia were incorporated into what became known as Greater Romania. This nearly doubled the country's size and brought its population to over 18 million. But this territorial success came with deep internal strain. The newly acquired regions were ethnically diverse. Millions of Hungarians, Jews, Ukrainians, Germans and others were now part of a Romanian state governed by a central authority in Bucharest. Romanian nationalism, historically rooted in the Orthodox peasantry and urban intelligentsia, was now tested by the reality of governing a polyglot kingdom. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Romanian politics was unstable. Governments rose and fell with regularity. Corruption was widespread. Meanwhile, extremist movements gained traction, chief among them the Iron Guard. Founded by Corneliu Zelea Codreanu in 1927, the Iron Guard was a militant, orthodox nationalist organization that combined anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and paramilitary violence. Codreanu, known to his followers as the Captain, built a personality cult that inspired thousands of students, rural youth, and disillusioned veterans. King Carol II, who ruled from 1930, initially tried to use the Iron Guard for his own purposes, but fearing their growing influence, he had Codreanu arrested and executed in 1938. This did not end the movement. If anything, it radicalized it further. Codreanu's successors, including Horia Sima, promised revenge. By 1939, Romania was a monarchy in name, but ruled increasingly by decree, with parties banned and the political system sliding into authoritarianism. At the same time, the regional situation was deteriorating. Hitler's rise in Germany and Stalin's ambitions in the Soviet Union placed Romania in an increasingly dangerous position. Although it had alliances with France and Britain, these powers were distant and, after the fall of France in 1940, powerless to intervene in the region. Romania was isolated. The territorial shocks of 1940 were devastating. In June, under Soviet pressure and with German acquiescence, Romania was forced to cede Bessarabia and northern Bukovina to the USSR. There was no resistance. Days later, under the Second Vienna Award, negotiated by Germany and Italy, northern Transylvania was handed to Hungary. Then, in September, southern Dobruja was ceded to Bulgaria. In just 3 months, Romania lost nearly a third of its territory and 6 million citizens. The population reacted with a mix of outrage and humiliation. Massive protests erupted. Confidence in King Carol II collapsed. On the 6th of September 1940, he abdicated in favour of his 19-year-old son, Michael, and fled the country. Power was handed to General Ion Antonescu, a conservative military leader who had previously been imprisoned by the king. Antonescu immediately formed an uneasy alliance with the Iron Guard, creating the so-called National Legionary State. Horia Sima, now head of the Iron Guard, became deputy prime minister. The regime combined Antonescu's military conservatism with the Guard's radical ideology. Together, they promised national renewal, retribution for territorial losses, and a total break with the political failures of the previous decades. In November 1940, Romania formally joined the Axis by signing the Tripartite Pact with Germany, Italy, and Japan. German troops began to arrive soon after, officially to defend the vital Ploiești oil fields from a possible British or Soviet attack. In reality, they were establishing Romania as a key strategic base for future operations in the east. But the alliance between Antonescu and the Iron Guard quickly unravelled. In January 1941, the Guard launched a failed rebellion, attempting to overthrow Antonescu and take full control of the state. The uprising was crushed in 3 days. Thousands of Guardists were killed, imprisoned, or exiled. Horia Sima fled to Germany. From that moment forward, Antonescu ruled alone, with King Michael remaining a symbolic figurehead. Antonescu, though authoritarian, was not a fascist in the classic sense. He did not embrace the revolutionary rhetoric of the Iron Guard, nor did he seek to imitate Mussolini. His regime was nationalistic, militarized, and religious, but fundamentally focused on state stability, territorial recovery, and the defense of Romanian interests. His calculus was simple. Germany had allowed the loss of northern Transylvania, but it was also the only power capable of reversing it. Aligning with Hitler gave Romania a chance to recover its prestige, rebuild its military, and secure its eastern frontier against further Soviet aggression. Antonescu believed that by demonstrating loyalty and military commitment, Romania would be treated not as a satellite, but as an equal partner in the Axis camp. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, Romania underwent rapid militarization. German officers and advisors worked alongside Romanian commands to train divisions, improve logistics, and standardize equipment. By spring 1941, Romania had mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops. Official propaganda portrayed the country as a Christian bulwark against Bolshevism. Church leaders echoed this message, framing the coming war as both political and spiritual. As Europe descended further into total war, Romania stood on the edge. It had lost territory, purged its politics, embraced militarization, and now found itself tethered to a rising German war machine. But to Antonescu and his generals, the coming conflict was not Hitler's war, it was Romania's. Their goal was not Berlin's conquest of Lebensraum, but the reversal of 1940, the recovery of Bessarabia and Bukovina, the defense of orthodoxy, the restoration of dignity, and for that, war with the Soviet Union was not a question of if, but when. On the morning of June 22nd, 1941, Romanian artillery positions opened fire along the length of the Prut River. The long-awaited war against the Soviet Union had begun. After nearly a year of political upheaval, territorial humiliation, and intense militarization, Romania now marched to war not as a pawn of Berlin, but as a self-determined actor, with its own goals, its own reasons, and its own score to settle. The initial invasion was coordinated in close alignment with German Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. But unlike the Hungarian or Slovak contributions, Romania's role was anything but symbolic. Marshal Ion Antonescu had committed nearly 325,000 Romanian troops to the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa, making Romania the second largest Axis participant after Germany itself. His message to the Romanian people was unambiguous. This was a war of liberation aimed at restoring the national territory lost to the Soviets in 1940, specifically the provinces of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. The Romanian order of battle was split between two primary formations. To the north, the Romanian Third Army, under General Petre Dumitrescu, advanced along the Dniester foothills toward Hotin and Chernowtsi. Their objective was to liberate Bukovina and push back the Soviet 12th Army from its defensive positions. To the south, the larger Romanian Fourth Army, commanded by General Nicolae Ciuperca, was tasked with crossing the Prut at multiple points and driving deep into central Bessarabia, supported loosely by German divisions of the 11th Army under General Eugen Ritter von Schobert. Initial resistance from the Red Army was fragmented. Soviet forces in the region, largely under the control of General Ivan Tulenev's Southern Front, were caught off guard and in the middle of reorganization when the Axis launched their surprise attack. Although heavily fortified positions existed around the Prut and Dniester lines, they were often undermanned, poorly supplied, or abandoned in the opening chaos. Within the first 48 hours, Romanian infantry had seized a number of key crossings and border villages. The pace of the advance surprised even Antonescu's general staff. In the north, Dumitrescu's units encountered light Soviet opposition near Siret and swiftly re-entered Chernowtsi, retaken after just a few days of fighting. In central Bessarabia, the 6th Corps under General Corneliu Dragolina pushed rapidly through the Prut Valley and began seizing railway lines and bridges around Chisinau, which Soviet engineers had only partially managed to destroy before retreating. While German panzer divisions surged further east through Galicia and Podolia, Romanian infantry slogged forward across thick mud, broken infrastructure and scorching heat. The roads of Bessarabia, many still unpaved, made rapid movement nearly impossible. Supplies had to be moved by horse-drawn carts, while communication lines were often disrupted by scorched earth tactics or partisans. Still, by early July, the majority of Bessarabia had been retaken. On July the 5th, Antonescu personally visited the front and entered the newly liberated city of Chisinau. He was accompanied by staff officers, Orthodox clergy, and a handful of foreign observers. A military parade was staged along the city's central boulevard, where Antonescu addressed a crowd of local civilians and soldiers, declaring that Romania had fulfilled its historic duty. Newspapers in Bucharest ran the headline, "The flag returns to Chisinau." But even as patriotic euphoria swelled across the country, events on the battlefield were beginning to shift. Romanian forces now faced a critical choice. They had succeeded in reclaiming the territories lost to the Soviet Union the year before. But the German High Command was pressing for further action. Hitler had no intention of allowing Romanian troops to simply halt on the Dniester and consolidate. He expected his allies to follow the Wehrmacht into Ukraine, and Antonescu, eager to prove Romania's loyalty and secure future territorial claims, agreed. Romanian troops now crossed the Dniester River into what had never been Romanian land before, Transnistria. The initial crossing was spearheaded by elements of the 5th Corps near the towns of Tigina and Dubasari, with German artillery units providing covering fire. The bridges had been partially demolished by Soviet engineers, so pontoons and ferries had to be assembled under fire. It was slow and dangerous work. Romanian sappers faced regular air attacks, and many soldiers drowned attempting the crossing under chaotic conditions. Once across, Romanian infantry encountered stiffer Soviet resistance. The retreating Red Army had now reorganized into rearguard positions along the southern Bug. Counterattacks became more frequent, and artillery duels intensified. In the north, the Romanian Third Army advanced through Mogilev and Soroka, encountering dug-in Soviet forces near the Dniester cliffs. In the south, the Fourth Army pressed toward the port city of Odessa, capturing the important rail junction at Tiraspol by mid-July. The battles in this phase became noticeably more attritional. Soviet units, including the 9th and 18th Armies, had regrouped and were now using better terrain, deeper trenches, and urban cover to slow the Axis advance. Romanian soldiers were increasingly under-equipped for this kind of warfare. Many carried Mannlicher rifles from the First World War. Machine gun units were few, and anti-tank capabilities were virtually non-existent. German liaison officers began to report supply shortages, inconsistent coordination, and morale issues within certain Romanian units, especially those stretched too far without rest or reinforcements. Nevertheless, the advance continued. Romanian troops cleared dozens of towns and villages along the lower Dniester and began to set up temporary occupation zones. At the same time, the German 11th Army pivoted toward Nikolaev and the Crimean Peninsula, leaving Romanian forces to hold large sectors on their own. This in turn stretched the lines even further. By early August, Romania had not only recovered its lost provinces, but now controlled a vast swathe of territory east of the Dniester. Yet the cost was mounting. Casualties had surpassed 22,000 men in just over 6 weeks of fighting. Many Romanian divisions were exhausted, their logistical trains crippled by the pace and scope of the operation. Reports from the General Staff spoke of infantrymen sleeping in ditches, low on food, low on water, and often operating without reliable maps or radio contact. Still, Antonescu pressed on. With the fall of Tiraspol and the German drive toward the Black Sea, he believed that Romania's position in Hitler's strategic orbit was now secure. By demonstrating not just political allegiance but military reliability, Antonescu hoped to one day revisit the issue of northern Transylvania, which had been ceded to Hungary under German pressure the previous year. But these political considerations would soon be overwhelmed by the realities of a protracted war in the east. For now, however, the Romanian High Command regarded the first phase of its campaign as a triumph. Bessarabia was back under the tricolour. The Soviets had been driven across the Bug, and the army, though battered, was still advancing. It was August 1941. The Wehrmacht was still pushing toward Kiev and Smolensk. Hitler was triumphant. And for Romania, the war was far from over. By the autumn of 1941, it was no longer a secret. Romania was not simply one of Germany's allies, it had become Germany's largest and most committed partner in the war against the Soviet Union, not by rhetoric, but by numbers. While Italy sent token expeditionary forces to Russia, and while Finland fought its own parallel war in the north, it was Romania that stood shoulder to shoulder with the Allies, to shoulder with the Wehrmacht across hundreds of miles of front line. In both manpower and battlefield exposure, no Axis nation aside from Germany itself bore a heavier burden on the Eastern Front. At the height of its commitment, Romania deployed over 600,000 men to the Eastern Front. That figure included 2 full field armies, auxiliary troops, gendarmerie units, engineers, and logistics personnel. By comparison, Italy's Corpo di Spedizione Italiano in Russia, CSIR, later the 8th Army, fielded around 230,000 men at its peak. Hungary's Second Army, which would suffer catastrophic losses at the Don in 1943, numbered around 200,000. Finland, though deeply involved in the continuation war, never deployed more than 350,000 troops total, and these were focused entirely in the northern sectors around Karelia and Lake Ladoga, not the southern meat grinder of Ukraine and the Caucasus. Romania's commitment wasn't limited to numbers. Its forces held entire sections of the southern front on their own. In 1941, they were responsible for the siege of Odessa, a massive operation conducted without direct German involvement. In 1942, Romanian armies were deployed along both the northern and southern flanks of Stalingrad, tasked with holding critical lines against Soviet counteroffensives. These weren't symbolic roles. They were frontline duties, sustained over years, with staggering losses. This level of involvement came at a terrible cost. By war's end, over 400,000 Romanian soldiers had been killed, wounded or captured, making Romania's wartime sacrifice on the Axis side second only to Germany itself. And yet, Romania's role is often forgotten. It lacked the propaganda machinery of Mussolini's Italy, the romantic narrative of Finland, or the intrigue of Vichy France. But when measured purely by battlefield contribution, troops, terrain, time, Romania was Germany's most important ally. Marshal Antonescu understood this, and he expected it to be recognized. He believed that such loyalty, paid in territory, oil and blood, would earn Romania not only Germany's respect, but diplomatic leverage to one day reverse the Second Vienna Award and reclaim northern Transylvania from Hungary. Whether that promise would ever be kept was another question entirely. But for now, in 1941, there was no denying it. Romania was Hitler's indispensable partner in the East. After the campaign in Bessarabia and Bukovina, Romania's war effort turned towards a target that would test its army more than any battle before, the Soviet fortress of Odessa. On August 8, 1941, Hitler formally ordered Marshal Ion Antonescu to seize the city. It was both a practical demand and a political test. Odessa was the main base of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, commanded by Admiral Philip Oktyabrsky, and a linchpin of Soviet control in southern Ukraine. But Hitler also wanted to see if Romania could carry the weight of modern war. The German 11th Army under Eugen von Schobert was already being drawn towards the Crimea. Odessa was left almost entirely to Antonescu's 4th Army. The defenders were formidable. General Georgy Sofronov, commander of the separate coastal army, had around 120,000 men at the outset, a mix of Red Army rifle divisions, naval infantry, and locally raised militia. Crucially, they had the support of the Black Sea Fleet. Every night, Soviet destroyers and transports brought fresh reinforcements and ammunition into the harbour. Every day, naval artillery rained shells onto Romanian lines. The city itself was ringed with 3 defensive belts. The outer line stretched some 80 kilometers, studded with bunkers, trenches, minefields, and anti-tank ditches. The middle belt was made of fortified villages and strong points. The final line ran through Odessa's suburbs, barricaded streets, factories turned into fortresses, and apartment blocks with every window a potential machine gun nest. Against this, Antonescu committed his 4th Army, commanded by General Nicolae Ciuperca. It included 14 infantry divisions, 2 cavalry divisions, the 1st Armoured Division, and the elite Vanatori de Munte mountain brigades. In total, nearly 340,000 men would be fed into the battle. They were supported by 1,300 guns, about 100 tanks, and the Aeronautica Regala Romana with nearly 300 aircraft. Luftwaffe units of Fliegerkorps 4 under General Kurt Pflugbeil provided heavier air power, and German engineers and artillery battalions would join later. The siege began on August 10th. Ciuperca ordered his divisions forward in massive assaults across the dusty Ukrainian steppe. In the south, the 13th Infantry Division advanced on Dalnik. In the east, the 1st Guard Division pushed toward Tatarka. The 1st Armoured Division tried to exploit breakthroughs, but the tanks, Czech-built R2s and old Renaults, were no match for Soviet anti-tank guns. Soviet artillery, directed by naval observers, pounded the open fields. Entire Romanian battalions were cut down before reaching the wire. By August 24th, after just 2 weeks, the Romanians had already suffered over 27,000 casualties. The fighting was savage. At Dalnik, Romanian infantry stormed Soviet trenches in waves, only to be met with bayonet charges from Red Navy Marines. At Tatarka, Soviet tanks counterattacked, driving the Romanians back through the same fields they had bled to capture. Romanian engineers tried to clear minefields under fire, crawling forward with bayonets to probe the soil. Casualties mounted by the hour. Ciuperca quickly realized that the frontal assaults were unsustainable. On September 3rd, he wrote to Antonescu urging a new plan: concentrate 6 divisions with heavy artillery in one sector and break through decisively instead of battering all along the line. Antonescu rejected the proposal. He demanded continuous pressure everywhere to prove Romanian determination. When Ciuperca argued again, Antonescu dismissed him. On September 9th, command passed to General Iosif Iacobici, a man less willing to question Bucharest. Under Iacobici, the siege intensified. Heavy artillery, including German-supplied 210mm and 305mm howitzers, were brought forward. The elite Vanatori de Munte under General Gheorghe Avramescu entered the fight, alongside cavalry brigades under General Mihail Rakoviță. Luftwaffe bombers hit Soviet positions daily, while Romanian aircraft strafed supply convoys. Yet every Romanian gain came at terrible cost. The battle became a war of villages and strongpoints. At Jabanka, Soviet troops established a bridgehead that threatened to roll up the Romanian flank. It took days of counterattacks and heavy bombing to destroy it. At Dalnik, houses were cleared with grenades and flamethrowers, often with Romanians and Soviets fighting hand-to-hand in the ruins. In Odessa's suburbs, barricades of overturned trams and sandbags blocked the streets. Romanian soldiers advanced block by block, hurling grenades through windows and setting entire buildings ablaze to clear snipers. Conditions for the soldiers were horrific. Men fought for weeks without rest, advancing in tattered uniforms, many barefoot after their boots disintegrated. Food and water were scarce. Ammunition was rationed so tightly that some artillery batteries were allowed only a handful of shells per day. Entire battalions went into battle hungry, carrying whatever they could scavenge from abandoned villages. By October, Romanian divisions were shadows of themselves. The 15th Infantry Division, which had marched in with 15,000 men, was reduced to fewer than 6,000 effectives. The 21st Infantry reported entire companies wiped out. Commanders resorted to summary executions of deserters to maintain discipline, and still, Antonescu pressed for victory. On the Soviet side, morale remained high. Reinforcements arrived nightly, fresh rifle battalions, naval infantry, even cadets from military schools. The Black Sea Fleet not only ferried in men, but also bombarded Romanian lines. Soviet destroyers and cruisers stood offshore, their guns pounding Romanian artillery positions with uncanny accuracy. Finally, on October 1st, with German forces advancing further east, Stavka ordered the evacuation of Odessa. Admiral Oktyabrski organized one of the most impressive Soviet operations of the early war. Over 2 weeks, more than 80,000 troops, thousands of civilians, and tons of equipment were ferried across the Black Sea to Sevastopol. All the while, Romanian and German aircraft attacked the convoys, and Romanian artillery shelled the harbour, yet the Soviets managed to save the bulk of their army. On October 16, 1941, Romanian patrols entered Odessa. The city was devastated. The harbour was mined and blocked with sunken ships. Buildings were booby-trapped, cellars rigged to explode. In the streets lay the wreckage of tanks, artillery and barricades. The Romanian tricolour was raised over the city centre, and Antonescu proclaimed a great victory. But the cost was staggering. In just 73 days of siege, the Romanian Fourth Army had suffered nearly 93,000 casualties, 17,700 dead, 63,300 wounded, and 11,400 missing. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought by Romania, a campaign that scarred an entire generation. For the Axis, Odessa was a secondary victory, For Romania, it was both triumph and tragedy, proof of loyalty to Hitler, but also a brutal lesson in the cost of modern war. The men who survived called it a bloodbath. The divisions that marched into Odessa never truly recovered, and the memory of its streets haunted Romanian soldiers for the rest of the campaign. With the fall of Odessa on the 16th of October 1941, Romania suddenly found itself in control of a vast new territory. Marshal Ion Antonescu created the Transnistria Governorate, stretching from the Dniester to the Bug. Odessa itself was named as the administrative capital, and the civilian governorship was handed to Professor Gheorghe Alexianu, a trusted ally of the regime. The city, however, was not pacified. Odessa remained full of Soviet sympathizers, underground NKVD agents, and armed partisans. The Black Sea Fleet continued to operate from bases further east, keeping lines of communication open for Soviet activity. Only 6 days into the occupation, on the 22nd of October 1941, a massive explosion rocked the former NKVD headquarters on Maraslievskaya Street, which the Romanians had turned into their command post. The blast collapsed much of the building, killing more than 60 Romanian officers and soldiers, along with a number of German liaison personnel. Among the dead was General Ion Glogojeanu, the city's military commander. The explosion was the work of Soviet partisans. It triggered immediate reprisals. Romanian forces carried out mass executions in Odessa, targeting those suspected of aiding the attack. The majority of those executed were Jews, both because the Soviet security services had recruited among minority groups in the city, and because they were collectively blamed as potential collaborators. Over the next several days, thousands were shot, hanged in public, or burned alive in warehouses that had been set on fire. Exact numbers vary. Romanian military reports speak of over 20,000 killed in the city between 22nd and 24th October, while Soviet investigations later put the figure even higher. What is certain is that the Odessa reprisals were among the bloodiest security operations carried out by Romania during the war. After this, the city was placed under tight security. Patrols, checkpoints and gendarmerie sweeps became part of daily life. Anti-partisan operations extended beyond Odessa into the villages of Transnistria, where Romanian troops clashed with Soviet guerrillas throughout the winter of 1941 to 42. Rear area security became a constant drain on manpower. For Romanian soldiers, this was a different war than the battlefields of Bessarabia or Odessa's siege. Instead of open clashes, they now faced ambushes on dusty roads, mines, sniper fire, and sudden explosions in occupied towns. Entire battalions were tied down on guard duty, escorting supply columns, or burning suspected partisan hideouts. Odessa was a victory, but it came at enormous cost. Nearly 93,000 Romanian casualties had been suffered in the siege. And now, even in occupation, Romanian forces remained locked in combat, not only at the front with the Red Army, but also in the shadows, against the partisans within the very city they had bled so heavily to capture. Inside Romania itself, Marshal Ion Antonescu stood at the height of his power. The dictator had delivered on his promise to Hitler. Romania had not only retaken Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, but had conquered far beyond the old frontiers. In speeches in Bucharest, Antonescu hailed the capture of Odessa as proof that Romania was not a minor partner, but Germany's most reliable ally. Crowds cheered, but beneath the surface the price was already visible. Over 90,000 casualties in a single campaign was a staggering loss for a country of barely 14 million people. Hospitals in Bucharest, Iași, and Cluj overflowed with wounded soldiers. Trains carrying coffins became a common sight. Antonescu pressed on regardless. In late October, he formally proclaimed the creation of the Transnistria Governorate, with Professor Gheorghe Alexianu as civilian governor. For the first time in its modern history, Romania was administering territory deep inside Ukraine. Odessa became the capital of this new province. Romanian troops were spread thin across its towns and villages, conducting constant anti-partisan sweeps. The countryside was never secure. Soviet agents had been left behind, and partisan bands harassed convoys ambushed patrols, and mined railways. Entire Romanian battalions were tied down guarding bridges and supply depots. While occupation consumed manpower, the Germans demanded more from Romania at the front. After the Odessa victory, Hitler wanted Romania's elite units transferred to the Crimea, where Erich von Manstein's 11th Army was engaged in heavy fighting. Antonescu agreed. By November 1941, the Mountain Corps under General Gheorghe Avramescu was on the move. Avramescu, a decorated First World War veteran, commanded some of Romania's toughest troops, the 1st, 2nd and 4th Mountain Brigades. They were specialists in difficult terrain, trained to fight in forests, ravines and frozen ridges, exactly the kind of landscape they would soon encounter in the Crimea. Alongside them, the Cavalry Corps, led by General Mihail Rakovița, deployed its fast-moving horsemen to plug gaps and chase down Soviet units retreating across the steppes. The Germans welcomed the reinforcements. Manstein's 11th Army had the thankless task of conquering the Crimea, one of the most heavily defended regions in the Soviet Union. Stalin had declared Sevastopol a fortress city to be held at all costs. Its garrison, reinforced by the Black Sea Fleet, was supplied directly from the sea. Every hill, ravine and ridge was fortified with concrete bunkers, minefields and hidden artillery. Romanian troops were thrown into action almost immediately. In late November and December 1941, the Soviets launched counter-offensives on the Kerch Peninsula, attempting to break the German siege of Sevastopol. The Romanian 1st Mountain Brigade fought ferociously in the frozen fields near Feodosia, where Soviet Marines and ski troops landed from the sea. Bitter fighting in sub-zero conditions raged for weeks. Avramescu's mountain soldiers, marching through blizzards with little winter clothing, counterattacked with bayonets to push the Soviets back into the sea. Losses were high, but the line held. Meanwhile, the Cavalry Corps was dispatched to chase down Soviet units attempting to infiltrate behind German lines. Romanian horsemen rode long distances across icy steppes, their lances replaced by rifles and light machine guns, engaging Soviet stragglers in close-quarter firefights. German officers noted the endurance of the Romanian cavalry, who operated in conditions that would have broken mechanized units. As winter deepened, the assault on Sevastopol ground into a brutal siege. Romanian mountain troops fought on the flanks of the city, storming ridges and fortified hills. One such position, known as the Corgun Heights, was taken only after repeated assaults in which Romanian companies were reduced to half strength. Manstein himself later wrote of the determination of Avramescu's brigades, who carried out tasks of extreme difficulty under constant artillery and air attack. Back in Romania, the political situation grew more tense. The Iron Guard, the fascist movement that Antonescu had crushed in January 1941, remained a lingering threat. Its exiled leaders accused Antonescu of sacrificing Romanian lives for German interests. Casualty lists from Odessa and Crimea fueled resentment among families already mourning their dead. At the same time, the Romanian economy strained under the weight of war. Oil shipments to Germany continued, but food shortages at home deepened as grain and livestock were requisitioned for the front. Letters from soldiers at Sevastopol complained of inadequate rations, thin uniforms, and the endless mud and cold of trench life. By early 1942, the Romanian army was fighting on two fronts at once, in the shadows of Transnistria against partisans, and on the cliffs and ravines of the Crimea against the Red Army. The commitment was enormous. Out of Romania's 26 divisions, nearly half were now tied down in either the occupation zone or in the 11th Army's lines. The siege of Sevastopol would drag on until July 1942, but even in the winter it had already become a battle of attrition. Soviet artillery from within the fortress pounded Romanian lines day and night. Black Sea Fleet warships stood offshore, firing heavy shells into Romanian positions. Casualties mounted steadily. Whole companies were frozen in their trenches, unable to move supplies up the twisting mountain tracks under constant fire. Antonescu, however, could not back down. Each Romanian success, each report of mountain troops storming a bunker or cavalry units capturing prisoners, was used in propaganda back home. The message was clear. Romania was fighting not as a junior partner, but as a full member of the Axis, shoulder to shoulder with the Wehrmacht. Yet beneath the official triumphalism, the cost was immense. Odessa had been a bloodbath. Now the Crimea was becoming another. By the spring of 1942, Romania had already lost tens of thousands more men. Its army was seasoned but worn thin, and Sevastopol, the great fortress of the Black Sea, still held out. Through the spring of 1942, the fighting in Crimea only grew more desperate. The Soviets reinforced Sevastopol by sea, landing fresh troops and supplies under the cover of night. Romanian patrols reported endless columns of Soviet Marines arriving, their presence soon felt in renewed counterattacks on the surrounding hills. Manstein, stretched thin, relied heavily on Avramescu's mountain brigades to hold exposed sectors of the line. On the Sapun heights and along the southern approaches, Romanian soldiers dug into rocky slopes, clinging to shattered trenches under relentless bombardment. The terrain offered little cover, and casualty reports from the brigades told of units reduced by half after a single day's fighting. In May, the Germans launched Operation Trappenjagd, the offensive to clear the Kerch Peninsula once and for all. Here too, the Romanians were central. Rakovica's cavalry corps advanced across open steppe, cutting down retreating Soviet units, while Romanian infantry supported the German drive. The operation was a success. Within days, the Soviet bridgehead was destroyed, and tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured. It was one of Manstein's most brilliant maneuvers, and the Romanians' mobility had been crucial. But victory at Kerch only cleared the way for the larger struggle still looming: the final assault on Sevastopol. By June 1942, preparations for the decisive attack were complete. Manstein had assembled a vast siege train, including the largest artillery pieces ever used in war. The German Dora gun, an 800mm monster, was brought to bear against the city's fortifications. Romanian batteries, though far smaller, joined in the bombardment, pounding Soviet positions day and night. Soldiers described the ground shaking continuously, clouds of dust and smoke hanging over the battlefield as if the land itself were on fire. On 7th June, the assault began. Romanian mountain troops advanced alongside German infantry into a storm of fire. Soviet defences were layered and deep, barbed wire, bunkers and minefields covering every approach. The Chorgan Heights, already a killing ground in winter, became a furnace once more. Avramescu's men attacked in waves, scaling ravines under artillery fire, storming trenches with grenades and bayonets. Progress was measured in meters, paid for with dozens of lives at a time. German reports acknowledged the determination of the Romanian brigades, who fought with grim resolve despite mounting losses. As June wore on, the Soviets were driven back yard by yard. The Sapun Heights fell after brutal close-quarters fighting. Entire Romanian companies were cited for holding captured positions under counterattack, fighting until their ammunition ran dry. On the sea, the Black Sea Fleet tried desperately to supply the fortress, but Axis air power and artillery made every voyage costly. By the end of the month, Sevastopol was encircled, its defenders running out of food and shells. The final blow came in early July. On the 1st of July, Axis troops surged into the city itself. Romanian units were among the first to break into the southern suburbs. Fighting raged in the streets, with bunkers hidden in cellars and machine guns firing from every ruined building. Avramescu's mountain soldiers cleared block after block, often with flamethrowers and hand grenades, while Rakovica's cavalry dismounted to fight as infantry in the rubble. Resistance was fanatical. Soviet troops fought to the last, sometimes refusing to surrender even when surrounded, but the end was inevitable. On the 3rd of July, organized resistance collapsed, and Sevastopol was declared captured. For Romania, it was another Pyrrhic victory. Its troops had played a central role in the siege, suffering horrendous losses. Estimates suggest that out of the 60,000 Romanians committed to the Crimean campaign, more than 20,000 were killed or wounded. The survivors were exhausted, many scarred by months of attritional warfare in the frozen trenches and blasted hills. Yet in Bucharest, Antonescu celebrated. propaganda trumpeted the fall of Sevastopol as proof of Romania's status as Germany's most important ally. Newspapers proclaimed the triumph of the Romanian soldier on foreign soil, while parades were held in the capital. But beneath the fanfare, reality told a different story. Romania's manpower reserves were shrinking. The economy buckled under requisitions. Families mourned the losses from Odessa and Sevastopol alike, and still the war was not over. Even as the fortress of the Black Sea fell, Hitler's gaze was turning east once more, towards the Volga and the Caucasus. Romania would be asked for more men, more sacrifices, and greater commitments than ever before. The fall of Sevastopol marked the peak of Romania's military power in the Second World War. It was both a triumph and a warning, proof of what Romanian troops could achieve, but also a reminder of the terrible cost still to come. The summer of 1942 brought with it the largest commitment of Romanian arms in the entire war. After the fall of Sevastopol, Romania had already demonstrated its willingness to bleed for the Axis cause, but Hitler now demanded far more. The Wehrmacht's new campaign, Operation Blue, aimed at nothing less than cutting into the Soviet Union's economic lifeblood, the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial cities on the Volga. German planners believed that if Stalingrad fell and the Caucasus was secured, the Red Army would collapse from lack of fuel and transport. But to achieve such a vast objective, Hitler needed allies to hold the line, and in 1942, no ally contributed more men than Romania. By July, 2 entire Romanian armies had been mobilized and sent east. The Third Army, now rebuilt and under the command of General Petre Dumitrescu, was a force of over 150,000 men. Dumitrescu, who had proven himself during the Odessa campaign, was trusted by both Antonescu and the Germans. Alongside him marched the Fourth Army under General Constantin Constantinescu Claps. His army was even larger, bringing the total Romanian commitment to around 25 divisions. Some 450,000 soldiers when support units were included. To put this in perspective, Italy, Germany's far better known Axis partner, fielded fewer men in the east than Romania did. Finland contributed perhaps a third of that number, and Hungary's forces, though significant, were still smaller. In sheer manpower, Romania was the Third Reich's most important ally on the Eastern Front. Moving these armies to the front was a colossal undertaking. During August 1942, whole regions of Ukraine saw endless convoys of Romanian infantry trudging eastward. Artillery units rattled along on horse-drawn wagons, while cavalry divisions still marched with their mounts, a reminder that Romania's army remained rooted in older traditions. Trains carried heavy guns, ammunition, and the few motorized elements the army possessed. The marches were long and punishing. The summer sun baked the steppe, dust caked the throats of soldiers, and water was scarce. Officers recorded that morale was still good, but discipline often wavered under the strain. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, boots wore through, and supply columns stretched for dozens of kilometers. By early September, these columns reached their positions on the Great Don Bend. Here, the German command distributed the Romanian armies along the flanks of Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, which was preparing its final push into Stalingrad itself. The strategic reasoning was simple. German forces would concentrate their power at the decisive point, the city, while the Allies would guard the long, exposed wings. Romania's Third Army was stretched out on the northern flank, covering over 100 kilometers of front. The Fourth Army, meanwhile, deployed to the south of the city, guarding the approaches across the Kalmyk steppe. From the beginning, the arrangement was dangerous. Romanian generals pointed out that their divisions were thinly spread. Dumitrescu repeatedly warned that his troops lacked modern anti-tank guns and heavy artillery. The standard Romanian 37mm and 47mm pieces, relics of the interwar years, were ineffective against Soviet T-34s and completely useless against the heavy KV tanks. Requests for German 75mm PaK-40s and other modern weapons were only partially met. In some sectors, entire divisions had only a handful of effective anti-tank guns. The rest relied on grenades, Molotov cocktails, or sheer improvisation. These weaknesses were not a secret. German commanders knew it, Dumitrescu certainly knew it, and Antonescu himself was warned in Bucharest. But the Wehrmacht's confidence in victory was such that these dangers were brushed aside. The Soviets, it was believed, were already on their last legs. Their counterattacks at Kharkov and Kerch had ended in disaster. Their army was retreating on every front. Surely they could not mount another major offensive. It was a fatal underestimation, one that would soon cost the Axis dearly. Life on the Romanian lines along the Don was harsh. Soldiers dug trench networks across the steppe, carving out dugouts and bunkers with little more than spades. Villages were fortified and turned into strong points, while bridges over the Don were guarded day and night. Supply was a constant headache. Food was scarce, uniforms ragged, and ammunition always limited. Soldiers often lived off requisitioned grain and livestock taken from local peasants. The terrain itself offered no comfort, a wide open steppe with little cover, subject to searing heat by day and cold winds at night. Men joked grimly that they were guarding a desert of grass. Yet morale remained complex. On one hand, Romanian soldiers knew their position was secondary. They were not the ones storming Stalingrad's factories and ruins. On the other, there was pride in the scale of their commitment. Newspapers back home trumpeted that Romania now fielded more divisions in Russia than it had ever fielded in its history. The sense was that the country was fighting not as a minor auxiliary, but as a full partner in Germany's war. In Bucharest, Antonescu was at the peak of his power. He used the summer's advances to argue that Romania's sacrifices would be rewarded. In his speeches, he reminded the public that northern Transylvania, ceded to Hungary in 1940, might one day be returned if Romania proved itself indispensable to Hitler. It was a powerful motivator to fight on the Volga in the hope of winning back lost soil at home. By late September 1942, the positions were set. Paulus's 6th Army was locked in combat within Stalingrad itself, fighting street by street through the ruins. To the north, Dumitrescu's 3rd Army watched the Soviet lines across the Don, exchanging artillery fire and occasional raids. To the south, Constantinescu Claps's 4th Army dug in against probing Soviet attacks from the Kalmyk steppe. Both Romanian armies were extended across impossibly long fronts, with little in the way of armoured reserves. It was a precarious situation, but it was the price of being Germany's largest ally in the east. By then, the soldiers could already sense that something was building. Soviet activity on the other side of the river increased. Convoys moved at night, artillery fire grew heavier, and reconnaissance flights spotted new concentrations of Soviet armour. Reports filtered back of Siberian divisions, tank corps, and guards units being shifted into the sector. Still, the official line from German headquarters insisted that these were only local reinforcements. Nothing to fear. The Romanian generals were less certain. Dumitrescu wrote privately that without modern weapons and proper reserves, his army could not withstand a major Soviet attack. His warnings went largely unheeded, and so by the end of September 1942, Romania stood committed as never before. 450,000 soldiers stretched from the Don to the steppe, anchoring the flanks of Germany's most ambitious offensive. The German High Command saw them as reliable guardians. The Romanian High Command feared they had been given a role beyond their strength. Both assessments would be put to the test in the months ahead. By the autumn of 1942, Romania's presence on the Don was impressive in scale, but fragile in substance. Behind the facade of 25 divisions and nearly 500,000 men lay crippling weaknesses that were the product of years of unfulfilled promises and failed modernization. Romania had begun a rearmament program back in 1935, a recognition that its World War I era arsenal was hopelessly outdated. But unlike Germany, Britain, or even Czechoslovakia, Romania had almost no domestic armaments industry. Every rifle, every gun, every tank had to be imported, and often in small irregular purchases that left the army with a patchwork of incompatible weapons. By 1941, Romanian infantry were still equipped with Austro-Hungarian and French rifles their fathers had carried in the trenches of the First World War. Artillery batteries were a museum of calibers and models bought from France, Czechoslovakia, or even captured stocks. The results were clear to anyone who inspected the front. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, attached to the German Third Army, was blunt. Romanian artillery had no modern gun to compare with either German or Soviet pieces. Communications equipment was too primitive to coordinate barrages across the vast front. Their anti-tank weapons, light 37mm and 47mm guns, were deplorably inadequate. Their tank units were little better, fielding obsolete French Renault R-35s that were death traps against Soviet armour. Mellenthin compared the situation to the Italian divisions in North Africa, brave men with outdated weapons, bound to break when the crisis came. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who had commanded Romanian units in the Crimea, was more diplomatic but no less clear. The Romanians, he wrote, were the best of Germany's allies, but courage could not make up for their lack of modern equipment. At Sevastopol and Kerch, they had shown tenacity, but those battles had already revealed their limitations. Against T-34s, bravery was not enough. Command and control only compounded the problem. Army Group B, the sprawling formation responsible for Stalingrad, was an unwieldy monster. It contained 8 armies, the German 2nd, 6th, 4th Panzer, and 16th motorised alongside the Romanian 3rd and 4th, the Italian 8th, and the Hungarian 2nd. Each spoke a different language, followed different procedures, and looked first to its own commander. Manstein later wrote that no headquarters could reasonably control more than 5 armies, and certainly not a mix of German and Allied ones spread over hundreds of kilometres. The Germans themselves recognised the absurdity of the situation. Plans were floated to create a new army group, Don, to be placed under Marshal Antonescu himself, which would take over responsibility for the southern sector. But Hitler insisted that Stalingrad must fall before any reshuffling could be considered. Until then, the Romanians remained under the overstretched Army Group B staff, dependent on German liaison officers for coordination, and subject to Hitler's increasingly bizarre directives, including, in October 1942, an order forbidding armies from maintaining liaison with their immediate neighbours in the line. The supply situation was scarcely better. The entire southern front relied on a single railway line across the Dnieper. That same line had to feed not just Army Group B around Stalingrad, but also Army Group A driving into the Caucasus. 6 pairs of trains per day were expected to sustain hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and millions of rounds of ammunition. Unsurprisingly, priority went to the German 6th Army inside Stalingrad. The Romanians on the flanks received what was left, often far too little. Food was short, fuel scarcer still, and timber or concrete for proper defensive works almost non-existent. Thus, by the time Romanian soldiers dug their trenches on the Don in September and October 1942, they were already at a fatal disadvantage. They faced a Red Army that was learning, recovering, and concentrating fresh divisions opposite them. Their commanders warned of the danger, but their pleas were ignored. The Romanians had been asked to guard a vast, exposed flank without the weapons, supplies, or support needed to hold it. When the Soviet storm finally came in November, the collapse would be swift and catastrophic. But it was not for lack of courage, it was for lack of everything else. By October 1942, the vast front along the Don River had settled into an uneasy stalemate. The thunder of the battle in Stalingrad could be heard in the distance. But for the Romanian soldiers deployed along the flanks, life was defined by mud, cold, and monotony. The Third Army under General Petre Dumitrescu stretched across a front of more than 140 kilometres northwest of the city, its divisions scattered thinly, each manned position separated by long gaps of barren steppe. The Fourth Army, under General Constantin Constantinescu Claps, was posted to the south, along an equally exposed front facing the Kalmyk steppe. Both armies knew that they were vulnerable, and both knew that reinforcements were not coming. Romanian soldiers spent their days digging. Trenches snaked through the flat grasslands, supported by dugouts cut into the frozen earth. But there was little timber, less concrete, and almost no barbed wire available. Defensive lines were fragile, shallow scrapes rather than proper fortifications. Men improvised roofs for their dugouts out of corrugated tin, planks from abandoned villages, or even doors scavenged from peasant huts. Winter clothing was scarce, and many troops relied on peasant sheepskin coats, bought or bartered from locals, to survive the biting winds that swept the steppe. Letters home reveal the mood. Sergeant Gheorghe Dumitru of the 15th Infantry Division wrote to his wife, "It is quiet now, but we hear the guns from the city day and night. They say Paulus will take Stalingrad any day, but here we only dig and wait. We have no proper guns against the tanks. If they come, God help us." Another soldier, Corporal Ion Calinescu, described the boredom punctuated by terror. "We sit in the earthworks like moles. Some days it is only the wind and the crows. Other days the Russian artillery sends us running for the dugouts. We have lost men to mines and to frostbite, and we have not even seen the enemy face to face." Officers were no less uneasy. General Dumitrescu filed repeated reports to Army Group B, warning that his army's front was too long to be defensible. His 11 divisions were stretched so far that each covered an average of 20 kilometers. With only a handful of German 75mm Pak-40 anti-tank guns supplied, often no more than 6 per division, Dumitrescu pointed out that entire sectors of his line were virtually naked against tanks. General Constantinescu Claps echoed these concerns from the southern sector, where his own troops faced wide expanses of open steppe with no natural obstacles. Both men understood that they were guarding Germany's most critical vulnerabilities with inadequate tools. Signs of Soviet preparation were everywhere. Prisoners taken in patrol clashes spoke of new divisions arriving in the rear. Supply columns were spotted at night, moving along tracks east of the Don. Soviet artillery fire grew more frequent and more accurate, probing Romanian positions, testing their reactions. In late October, Romanian cavalry patrols reported heavy concentrations of Soviet armour behind the lines opposite Serafimovic and Kletskaya, exactly where the Third Army's weakest units were posted. Yet higher headquarters dismissed these warnings. German officers reassured the Romanians that the Red Army was spent, that its reserves had already been exhausted in Stalingrad. Hitler insisted that the Soviets were incapable of mounting another major offensive in 1942. In Bucharest, Antonescu clung to the belief that Romania's sacrifices would secure its place at Germany's side. Casualty reports were suppressed in the press, replaced with propaganda about heroic endurance on the Volga. On the ground, however, the daily grind wore down morale. Rations were poor: black bread, frozen potatoes, and thin soup. Cigarettes became currency, traded for favours or food. Sentries froze in shallow foxholes, stamping their feet to stay awake through the long nights. Ammunition was rationed, and men were told to conserve even hand grenades for the decisive moment. Some units, like the 1st Cavalry Division, still relied heavily on horses, tethered in the open steppe, where frostbite and hunger claimed nearly as many animals as Soviet fire. Still, there was no collapse. Romanian troops had endured the horrors of Odessa and Crimea. They were seasoned, if poured on, as our fathers held the Siret, one colonel declared to his men. But the strain was evident. Desertions rose, particularly among ethnic minorities conscripted into the ranks. In one incident in early November, a patrol from the 9th Infantry Division discovered a group of deserters hiding in a peasant hut, exhausted and half frozen. They confessed they could no longer face the endless digging and the fear of tanks. By mid-November 1942, the storm was ready to break. Across the river, the Soviets had assembled entire tank armies in secrecy. Artillery barrels were lined up hub to hub, masked by camouflage nets. Ammunition was stockpiled in immense quantities. Romanian soldiers, scanning the horizon from their trenches, saw little, but they felt the tension grow. A sergeant from the 5th Infantry Division later recalled, "The ground shook at night. We thought it was thunder, but it was the Russian tanks moving. We knew something was coming." The Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, sections of the Romanian 3rd Army northwest of Stalingrad. Trenches that had been depth. His divisions, scattered across a front more than 100 kilometers long, were simply pulverized where they sat. At Kletskaya, Soviet infantry and tanks surged, commanded by General Constantin Sănătescu, tried to resist, but its antiquated 37mm anti-tank guns bounced shells harmlessly off the advancing T-34s. So we were throwing stones at a steel wall. The Soviet 5th Tank Army and 21st Army drove straight through the Romanian lines. Entire battalions broke apart in minutes. Communications failed almost immediately. Telephone lines were cut, radios were scarce, and orders could not reach the front. Within hours, the Third Army's flank disintegrated. Regiments fled, not from cowardice, but because they had no weapons capable of halting the armoured tide. To the south, on the 20th of November, the same scene unfolded against the Romanian Fourth Army. Here too, Soviet artillery roared at dawn, blasting the positions of the 1st Cavalry and 20th Infantry divisions. General Constantin Constantinescu Claps could only watch as the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies poured through. His men, already exhausted and ill-equipped, had been holding a front twice as wide as they could defend. The collapse was inevitable. But Fimovic, Romanian tank crews fired round after round at T-34s to no effect, then watched in horror as the Soviet machines cut them down in return. One out of roughly 220,000 Romanians committed to the Stalingrad front, over 150,000 were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Those taken captive faced a new ordeal. Forced to march east in the snow, often without food, they collapsed by the roadside. Survivors of the marches recalled columns of thousands dwindling day by day. Frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion claimed men even before they reached the camps. Those who survived the journey found only starvation, waiting. Of the 110,000 Romanian soldiers captured at Stalingrad, fewer than 8,000 ever returned home after the war. In the chaos of the encirclement, isolated Romanian groups fought to the end. At Bolshoi Donschinka, remnants of the 15th Infantry Division made a last stand in a frozen village, fighting until ammunition ran out. General Mihail Laska, commanding the 6th Corps, refused to surrender his men when surrounded. He tried to organize a breakout with what little artillery and armor remained, but was overwhelmed. Captured, he spent the rest of the war in Soviet custody. For those left in the city itself, alongside Paulus's 6th Army, the fate was sealed. Romanian soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder with the Germans in the ruins of Stalingrad, holding cellars and trenches against Soviet assault. Their uniforms and language set them apart, but in the cauldron, suffering was universal. Starvation, frostbite, and ceaseless bombardment reduced them to shadows. When Paulus surrendered on the 2nd of February 1943, among the 90,000 men who laid down their arms were thousands of Romanians. Emaciated, many could barely walk. Soviet guards herded them into columns and marched them away through the snow. For most, it was a death sentence. The destruction of the 3rd and 4th Armies at Stalingrad was the greatest military catastrophe in Romanian history. In 2 months, the country lost more men than it had in years of the First World War. Whole families back in Iași, Cluj and Bucharest received nothing but silence. Their sons vanished into the steppes. In Bucharest, Marshal Antonescu attempted to frame the disaster as heroic sacrifice, declaring that Romania had stood at the edge of Europe, holding back the Asiatic tide. But behind the rhetoric, the truth was plain. Romania's greatest armies had been annihilated, its soldiers abandoned to fight an impossible battle with inadequate weapons, and its fate as Hitler's ally was now bound to a war it could no longer win. The fall of Stalingrad was not just the end of the German 6th Army, it was the death of Romania as Germany's most important ally. In the snow and ruins of that city, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies were destroyed almost to the last man. Over 200,000 soldiers had gone into battle, the majority never returned. It was the bloodiest defeat in Romania's history, far eclipsing even the losses of the First World War. Entire villages in Moldova, Wallachia and Transylvania were left without their young men. Trains no longer brought back soldiers, only silence and the official notices of death. For a brief moment in 1941 and 1942, Romania had stood as the Reich's second pillar on the Eastern Front. Antonescu had delivered more divisions to Hitler than Mussolini, Horthy, or any other Axis partner. While Finland fought a separate war and Italy bled in North Africa, it was Romanian infantry and cavalry who marched beside the Wehrmacht from the Prut River to Odessa, from the Bug to Crimea, from the Don Bend to the Volga. In numbers, only Germany itself committed more to the Eastern Front. But bravery and sacrifice were not enough to survive modern war. Romania's army, though large, had been crippled from the start by outdated weapons and a weak industrial base. The promised rearmament program never delivered. Divisions went to the front with World War I rifles, French field guns from 1916, and light tanks that could not even scratch the armour of a T-34. German commanders praised Romanian courage in official reports, but in private they compared them to the Italians, soldiers asked to do the impossible with nothing in their hands. After Stalingrad, Romania could never recover. Its armies were rebuilt on paper, and replacements were sent to the front in 1943, but they were shadows of what had come before. Casualties mounted again at the Mius River, in the Kuban, and in the Crimea. The Soviets remembered well how Romania had fought deep inside Russia, and when the tide of war turned, vengeance followed. Villages in Bessarabia and Bukovina were retaken. The Black Sea Fleet bombarded Romanian positions relentlessly. Inside the country, grief turned slowly to doubt. Mothers of the fallen asked what their sons had died for in the endless fields of Russia. Antonescu's speeches about holy war against Bolshevism rang hollow as casualty lists grew longer. Even among officers, confidence in Germany began to waver. They saw that Hitler no longer won battles, as in 1940 and 1941, but fought defensive campaigns, bleeding allies first before committing his own. By 1944, Romania was exhausted. Its oil fields, so critical to Germany, had been bombed by American bombers flying from Italy. Its economy was collapsing under the strain of occupation and requisition. In March, Soviet armies crashed into northern Romania, tearing through Moldavia. By summer, the Red Army was on the Prut again, the same river where it had all begun. On the 23rd of August 1944, everything changed. King Michael, together with generals and politicians who had lost all faith in Hitler, carried out a coup d'etat. Marshal Antonescu, the man who had led Romania into the war and into disaster, was arrested in the royal palace. Within hours, Romania switched sides, declaring war on Germany and aligning itself with the Allies. Overnight, the Axis lost its greatest partner. The consequences were enormous. German forces still in Romania were caught in chaos. The Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe turned their guns on their former ally, burning fuel depots and clashing with Romanian troops in Bucharest and Ploiești. But by then, the game was over. The Red Army poured through the Carpathians, and Romania's armies now marched westward against their former comrades, fighting through Hungary and into Czechoslovakia. By the time the war ended in 1945, Romania had lost close to 500,000 men killed, wounded or missing. From the bloody retreat out of Bessarabia in 1940, through Odessa, Crimea and the killing fields of Stalingrad, Romania's sacrifice had been enormous. It was, in every sense, the Axis partner that bled most for Hitler's ambitions, and yet, unlike Italy, it received little attention. Its role was overshadowed, forgotten, reduced to footnotes in histories that focused only on Germany and the Soviet Union. But the record is undeniable. Romania fielded more soldiers for Hitler's war in the east than all other allies combined. It fought in every major campaign on the southern front, from Barbarossa to the fall of Sevastopol, from the Don to the Volga. It was annihilated at Stalingrad, rebuilt, and then destroyed again in 1944. And when the cost became unbearable, it was the Romanian people themselves, through their king and their officers, who ended the alliance, toppled Antonescu, and joined the other side. In the end, the story of Romania in the Second World War is one of tragedy and contradiction. It was Germany's most faithful ally, and then one of its fiercest enemies. And this brings us to the end of our video. If you found this story as powerful and overlooked as we did, then please consider subscribing. There are so many more forgotten battles, lost divisions, and untold histories still waiting to be uncovered. Leave a like to support the channel. It helps more than you know. Comment below, have you ever heard of Romania's full role in the war? And if you want more content like this, share it, because history deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching.